Hi, my name is Adam Shoemaker, and I'm rector here at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in Charleston, back for another edition of Rector's Corner. And I'm very happy to have with me today the Reverend Dr. Philip Linder, the priest in charge of St. Mark's Episcopal Church on the peninsula and the chair of our Bishop Search Committee, and Pat Neumann, the chair of our Diocesan Transition Committee. And they will be speaking to us today about the process from start to finish of how we are going about electing our next diocesan bishop. Welcome to you both. And Phil, I will start with you. As chair of the search committee, I wonder if you could tell me what the charge was given to the committee from our standing committee.
So thank you, Adam, and thank you for having me. I appreciate being with you. The charge obviously was informal language, but to put it sort of in the informal language, we were charged with coming up with a slate of nominees for the election of the 15th Bishop of South Carolina. The Diocese of South Carolina, we have in our Constitution and canons, the statement or the provision, if you will, that we must have at least 3 candidates for bishop. So we knew that 3 would be the minimum number, and there was no limit on the upward number. And we, went into this from the beginning, really not knowing what that final number would be. I'll say a little bit more about that later. I don't know that we expected it to be as many as 5, but because of the quality of the candidates, we had 5 obviously on the ballot, and even that was difficult to get to that point. But that was the charge. It was to be done within a timely fashion. Obviously, the chair of the search committee and the search committee reports to the president of the standing committee and the standing committee. So Caleb Lee and the standing committee were those that gave us the charge, and then also were the ones that we were accountable to. So when we finished the process, those names then were presented by me to the president of the standing committee and the standing committee. And that's how we got where we are today.
And your process, I know, Phil, was upended by COVID, that you started the process before COVID, just before COVID, and had to take a pause. Can you tell us a little bit about what the process ended up looking like? I don't know if you can tell us how many names you started with, but if you could speak to how you ended up with the slate we were presented with, and in broad brushstrokes, that would be lovely.
Absolutely, and I can give you some, some generals. There are some things I'm not at liberty to discuss, but obviously you pointed to this thing that we're all aware of right now, which is COVID-19 and the pandemic. So we started our process officially in January of 2020, and we, as a search committee, we were, having some conversation prior to that. But our first meeting was in January, and we only met as a search committee in person 3 times before COVID happened, and we were moving to virtual. But as you are both aware and know, what happened very quickly was we came to the conclusion that because of what was happening nationally with the pandemic, we really would have to put this process on pause. It was not an easy decision to make with the standing committee officially made that decision, but certainly I was working with them as well as with our consultant, Rick Calloway, as to stopping. So we were kind of going full speed and had a lot of momentum going at that point, and then just had to go into a pause mode until we were able to start back up, which was this past August, where we then started again meeting virtually, and actually in truth began the process of receiving names. So I'll say a little bit about that, and you can jump in, obviously, Adam, with a question if I overlook something. It's sort of, a lot of it's all blurring right now, as it's been a lot to digest, and I've been away from it now just a little bit of time, so I've had a chance to breathe. What is amazing, I'll say a couple of things. I had an amazing committee to work with. I never imagined 16 people, that includes me, could gel like we did. I think that's probably where I had the most angst, and that's probably what kept me up at night. You know, how are we going to get all of these folks to come to consensus? And I will say to you that very quickly we gelled as a body, and we were immersed in prayer. We had an incredible consultant, the Reverend Rick Calloway from the Diocese of Atlanta, who has done, numerous processes like this as a consultant throughout the church in his retirement. And he was great in guiding us. Obviously, that was his role. He did not have any kind of a decision-making role. He was just gently guiding us and was certainly, for me, a tremendous resource. But once we got going and got the profile established, which obviously is online, that was a huge piece of work. Several of the members in particular worked very hard on that. And I'll say here that I didn't have anyone on the committee that didn't carry their weight. Everybody had their tasks and really worked hard at them. So obviously working to get the profile completed initially, working with Molly Hamilton of the diocese in communications. She was actually hired by our committee to work with us in getting all of that up on the website and all of the forms and all of that. She worked very closely with me. Obviously, she then had to back off once we got into the confidential mode of this process, once we started to receive names. It is remarkable how many names we received. You know, I will say to you that what I can say to you, it was an unusually large amount of names that were received by our diocese. I think that it was sort of twofold. I think there was just an enormous amount of interest in what was happening here in the Episcopal Church here in South Carolina, and people that really wanted to see if this was a call for them in this time in the life of our diocese. And I think, quite honestly, the other piece of it is that we are South Carolina, and we're Charleston, South Carolina, as well as the entire diocese. And it's a very pleasant place, I think, for most people to want to come to and live. Now, obviously, out of all of the names that we received, what I did is so all of the initial communication was with me privately. My email, the South Carolina Bishop email to me, was a confidential one that only I had access to. Those names were submitted to me either through a formal nomination process or through a formal application process by the candidate themselves. Everyone, you couldn't just call me on the phone and say, hey, I got a great name for you, this person, check them out. You still had to do the formal process. Obviously, some of the people that were nominated initially as possible candidates declined and said, gosh, this is not a good time for me to leave. This is not a good time for me to move, whatever it might be. A number of people said no, which honestly was a good thing, because I don't think we could have managed the numbers otherwise. But the folks that actually went through with applying for it was a very large number. And not only that, but an incredible pool of candidates. And I know this from our consultant, who said to me, this is unusual, the amount of really qualified, capable, really dynamic people that have put their names forward. So it was not easy. So we moved from receiving all of those names to then moving into what was the initial interviews, which everything in this process was virtual, which was a scary thought initially, but actually worked out beautifully. I divided the committee into 4 teams of 4 people, and those teams then were assigned different candidates for the initial interviews. Following the initial interviews of the people that had applied, we then had our first formal cut as to who we would move forward with. That being said, there were some people cut that never got to be interviewed, that really just didn't make the mark initially to even be in this process. That generally does happen. People that just didn't have the experience to be in this process. So once we got through that, we had our first cut, and then we moved forward with those nominees with doing reference checks, beginning the background checks. All of that went through me. All of the background checks went through me. Fortunately, you know, that went very smoothly. It's a pretty detailed, long process. And so from the all of the materials then that we had on the people that we had interviewed, we then went back into another set of interviews whereby we all interviewed all of the people that we were now considering. The teams actually compared notes, and it was obviously quite a process. And on the basis of that period of time, then we decided as a committee who we would bring back for the final, what normally is called a discernment retreat, which obviously is normally in person. And actually I had that all set up before the pandemic hit, the in-person retreat. But this was done virtually too. And, you know, it was brilliant because I had two great young priests on the committee, both of whom I became very, very close with in this process, and who were our technical folks that actually behind the scenes worked this whole process, and it went without a glitch. I will say we brought back 9 people to that final retreat, of which obviously you know that we have selected 5. One of the things that I continue to say to the committee was that my goal, and we indeed reached it, was that any one of the people that we present to the diocese as a nominee, we should feel, although they would be different, could be an excellent bishop for the Diocese of South Carolina in this time that we're in. And I will say to you that making that final cut following the retreat was not easy. We had brought back 9 really stellar folk, and had to then, on the basis of everything we saw, and obviously, you know, we went into it with no you know, preconceived notions. I said to folks, you have to leave all your biases and prejudices, you know, at the door. Everybody has to have a completely fresh slate as we look at them. And, you know, people, you know, rose to the occasion. Some really, you know, became then absolute stars at the retreat. All of them were good, don't get me wrong. And then we had to come back together. Following that time, I asked the committee to take a week in prayer and not to talk about it with any of the other any of the candidates, and obviously no communication with the nominees, but to just on their own pray, discern. And it is amazing that when we got together for what turned out to be almost a 6-hour Zoom meeting, surrounded in prayer, we all agreed on the 5. There was actually consensus of 16 people. Now, obviously, there was give and take by all of us. You know, that's going to happen. But what was amazing is we trusted that when the vast majority was strong about someone, that even if we thought, oh gosh, you know, maybe this person rather than, we went as a group, as a committee with that. That when we finished, everyone felt confident that God had put these 5 people before us. And the final thing, I know I've talked too much, the final thing that I'll say about that is I also kept reminding the search committee that we were not electing the bishop. We were choosing a slate of nominees, of which the diocese, the people, the lay people, and the clergy will elect the next bishop. And that was a piece of really wonderful advice that Rick Calloway gave to me. You know, said just remind folks, because sometimes people think they're choosing the bishop, like, oh gosh, is that going to be the bishop? You know, you have to trust in the movement of the Holy Spirit and say God's will be accomplished and the right person will get elected. So that might be more than you wanted to know, Adam. I don't know.
Oh, that's a wonderful description, and thank you so much for your leadership of the process. We certainly have before us a very diverse and accomplished set of nominees. I heard, Phil, just as an aside, that the day that you were interviewing the 9, was that not January 6th? Were you having that process unfolding as the Capitol was being invaded?
So if you can imagine this, yes, and not only that, but we were actually interviewing or actually working, he was making a presentation to us, Jeffrey Hoare, who's the rector of St. Albans in Washington, D.C., and it was happening in that moment. And it was unbelievable because he lives off of DuPont Circle, and you could hear the police sirens racing by. And honestly, again, not to speak to one candidate or the other favorably or unfavorably, they're all favorable in my mind. It was amazing that he could carry on with what was happening where he lives, but it was enormously upsetting to all of us. And it was a distraction. However, we got through it, and we prayed about it, obviously, but it was very, very upsetting to all of us. And I especially felt for Jeffrey Hoare, who didn't know really what was going on outside his doors.
That's remarkable.
Yeah.
Well, as the search committee was wrapping up its work, the transition committee that I sit on, that Pat is a co-chair of, was preparing to take things from there. And I wonder, Pat, if you could say something of what the charge is to the transition committee.
I can, but first I want to thank the search committee for all of the work that you did. When I first heard about the 5 candidates and looked up a little bit on each one of them, I said, this is wonderful. I can't imagine the hard work it took to get there. And I as a member of the diocese, very much appreciate all the work that you all did. And also, before I get started, I want to give a shout out to my co-chair, Rick Stahl. We co-chair the committee. Rick Stahl is the senior warden at the Church of the Messiah in Myrtle Beach. Just like the search committee, our responsibilities are outlined in the canons. And in particular, I'm just kind of reading because so that I make sure that I have it all complete. We are to publish the complete profiles of the nominees as well as other educational material that's relevant. We provide for walkabout opportunities for all nominees to meet with as many members of the diocese as possible. We provide hospitality for the nominees and their families. We help in planning the consecration of the new bishop. We will assist the new bishop in adapting to and being introduced to the diocese, and we provide for the transition of the retired and/or resigned bishop for office. So we basically have 6 things that we are charged with. Another thing that we did, which is not listed here, is that we are providing prayer partners or shepherds, whichever term you'd like to use, for the nominees. And Reverend Shoemaker is in charge of that particular committee. And what we've done is lined up a member of the clergy that is on the transition committee with one of the nominees so that they can get together and talk and pray and throughout this whole process, because it is quite a process. And I can imagine it's a little disarming at times.
Well, and because we continue to sojourn in this wilderness called COVID, much of our work is going to have to continue virtually for safety reasons. Pat, can you talk a little bit about the timeline of how things will unfold?
Yes, I will. And a little bit about our bullet point number 2 here about the walkabout opportunities. We're also calling, if you can hear both terms, because we've also kind of segued to candidate conversations, since we're not going to be actually walking about anywhere. We'll be doing this all virtually. And while we're all sitting here, I want to give a shout out to Dr. Robert Ball, who is in Reverend Shoemaker's congregation. He has given us tremendous guidance on the coronavirus and COVID-19 and what we should be doing and what we should not be doing. And I feel very comfortable with his expertise. So that has been wonderful. What we've done, and I'm going to focus a little bit on the nominees meeting with as many members of the diocese as possible, and also the members of the diocese getting to know the nominees. And we came up with quite a bit that we're doing. First off, these candidate conversations will be the actual official ones, April 12th, April 13th, and April 14th. And they will sort of go on all day, although we will have a break in the afternoon. And I'll get to that in a minute, but I wanted to tell you what our opportunities are here and what we put together to make sure that everybody knows each other as well as possible in this virtual format. For the candidates to meet us, we've already sent them welcoming gift boxes that have everything in them, from Gullah Bibles to Grace Cathedral coffee mugs to t-shirts for Myrtle Beach. And we feel like that's giving them a piece of our Southern hospitality. We've asked each church in our diocese for a 2-minute video about their congregations. And these will all be knitted together and sent to the candidates so that they can view them at their leisure and as often as they want to. We've asked all the members of our diocese to submit candidate questions for the candidate conversations. We think this will give the candidate, as they hear these questions, they'll learn a little bit more about the people in the diocese, what their concerns are, what's important to them, and important enough to actually submit a question to go before these forums. Deaneries can submit a video if they want to, highlighting different aspects of important places in their respective areas and important things that they're doing. For instance, the Southern Deanery has produced a video that highlights 2 prison ministries in which they're involved, and a Reconstruction era National Historic Park, as well as the Pat Conroy Literary Center. So this gives you more information about the deaneries and what they're doing. We're also going to be producing a Welcome to South Carolina video, which will cover the entire diocese, look at areas of interest. One, of course, is Camp St. Christopher. We put a lot of information in there from everywhere so that they can understand what we're all about here, what there is to see, what there is to do, and what it's like to be living in our diocese. Now, on the flip side of that, how are the members of the diocese going to meet our candidates? Well, we have the Bishop Search website that's a part of our diocesan website. And there are photos of all of the candidates, as well as their biographical data, resumes, and answers to essay questions that were posted, and they're all posted on that website. So you can go read a tremendous amount of information about them. There will be 2-minute introductory videos from each of them, and we are supposed to have those by the end of the week and hope that they will be out next week, also posted on the website. One of the things we're very excited about, I will give a shout out to the Diocese of Oregon, because this is where this idea came from. We're going to be doing one-on-one interviews that will be conducted by Elsa McDowell of the Post and Courier. She'll be doing this the last week in March, and we will post those on the website the following week. And I could just mention the actual candidate conversations. There will actually be 2 parts to that. There will be a panel discussion in the morning, where all 5 candidates will be on a virtual stage, and we will be posing questions to them in that format. That format will be recorded, so if someone cannot make those particular events, they will be able to view them later. Then early evening, we will be having a more casual conversations with the candidates, and these will be one-on-one, which again will be more questions, but as the consultant, Rick Calloway, who is also working with us, said, what a bishop does is go out to a different church basically every weekend, and then meet with people in a coffee hour after the service is over. And this won't quite be that format, but this will give you an opportunity of how it would be to maybe have, get a cup of coffee and talk with them while we're having those pieces of the candidate conversations. So even though we're virtual, I think we've come up with a good way for everybody to learn more about each other. And so we're very excited about that. So I hope everybody will take advantage of it, whether they're a delegate or not, because we will be learning a lot about the person who will be becoming the next bishop of our diocese.
Absolutely. And I will note that the transition committee has been hearing from other dioceses, Oregon, Chicago, dioceses who have had their processes online in a virtual format, and this has successfully happened. And there have been other bishops elected through this virtual process. And I do think that there will be many opportunities for folks to get to know them moving forward. And all this is moving towards our electing convention, which will take place on May the 1st. And it is still being determined whether that will be in person at Grace Church Cathedral as originally scheduled or online. But Phil, I know that you have been a nominee for bishop. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the day of an electing convention and how we in the Episcopal Church elect bishops.
Okay, yeah, it will be different if it's virtual, and my suspicion is that it will be, but we'll see. Time will tell whether that will happen or not. So typically on the day of an election, a convention is dedicated just to the election. So it's called the electing convention, which ours is as well. And what normally would happen in person, but I think this will all translate virtually if we wind up doing it virtual, is that it will be wrapped in some kind of a worship experience, which is normally the Eucharist. Obviously, if it's virtual, it most likely will not be the Eucharist, but some kind of office or prayer service around that election. So there are ballots, and you have two houses, if you will, in the body of each diocese, as you do in the larger church, in the national church as well. You have the convention, the diocesan convention deputies, and they are made up of both lay people and clergy. And the two bodies split that way, laity and clergy. So each of the parishes in the diocese will have their deputies to, we call them deputies or we call them delegates in this diocese. I think delegates, right? Is that correct?
That's right.
That's right. Yeah. And I just say that because I've served now 6 dioceses, so it's a little bit tricky to keep up with. But what will happen is in each church, and I've just recently kind of looked into that. Each church in our diocese sort of has their own constitution and canons as to how they select those folks and who those folks will be. For instance, here at St. Mark's, we which is typical of most all other churches, at our annual convention is when those folks are elected, and they will represent the church in the election of the next bishop. And what you have to get as a candidate, as a nominee, and interchangeable there, for bishop, is you have to get 50 plus 1 in both orders. So in the order of the laity and in the order of the clergy. I know for a fact that obviously in this diocese, the laity way outnumber the clergy. The clergy number is really a small number in this diocese. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of 26, 28, something like that, who can actually vote. And the laity, but it won't matter. I mean, it's equally weighted because a nominee has to win in both of those orders, both of those houses, whichever you want to call it. You have to have 50 plus 1 in the laity and 50 plus 1 in the clergy. So I can share from my experience, there's ballots. So the first ballot, it's all obviously confidential and secret. If you're in person, normally it's not done electronically, although it could be. It's done, with a paper ballot. If it's virtual, it's obviously going to be electronic, and I think that will work brilliantly because it worked very well for our diocesan convention. You vote the first ballot. Typically, no one gets elected on the first ballot. It has happened. It recently happened in the Diocese of Georgia. But you have to win both houses. But anything can happen when you get together like that in the midst of the Holy Spirit working. I will share that it will be different if we're doing it virtually, because part of what happens in person, and I've experienced this not only as a nominee, but also as in the Diocese of Lexington, Kentucky. I was there for the election of their last bishop, well, 2 bishops ago, actually. is that there's some kind of politicking that often goes on in between, or people kind of, I hate to call it politicking, but people sort of going around and talking and trying to come to some consensus. I'm not sure how that would work virtually. It could actually be more true to the Holy Spirit. I don't know. Is that helpful, Adam?
Yeah, no, I have been present for a couple of bishop elections. When I was a college student in Boston, Massachusetts, I once counted the ballots, helped to count the ballots for the election that elected Bud Cedarholm as the suffragan bishop of Massachusetts. And that was really fascinating because for a couple of ballots, the laity were going one way and the clergy were going another way. And for a couple of ballots, there was no movement. We counted the ballots and it was exactly the same a couple of times. And so it is interesting to think about how the Spirit intercedes in the midst of that, and how in time a candidate emerges and is ultimately elected. And it's I'm sure a humbling thing for anybody to even make a slate, because to even have made a slate means that you have gone from the beginning of a bishop search process and gotten through many stages, and have certainly been deemed, as you have said, Phil, of the 5 that we have before us, impressive enough of a candidate that your committee has said that you would think that anybody who we would elect from this slate would be a fine diocesan bishop for South Carolina. So I'm sure it is a humbling thing to think about those who are before us, and certainly all of them and their families and the communities that they come from should be held in our prayers, because the process, of course, is kept strictly confidential up until the moment that the slate is made public. And at that moment, it's not just those nominees who are public to the diocese that they might one day be a bishop for, but now it is public to the congregations and the dioceses that they serve. And I'm sure all of those communities have mixed feelings. I'm sure there's probably a feeling of pride that your priest has been thought highly enough to potentially be a bishop, but then you're also having to carry on in ministry with them, thinking that perhaps they may be leaving soon to go elsewhere. So I'm sure there's a lot of mixed feelings all the way around.
Adam, I'll just add to that, because you're speaking so beautifully to it, is that there's an incredible sense of vulnerability when you allow yourself to go through this and you allow yourself to stand for election. Because obviously on the day of the election, 4 people will not be elected, and 1 will be. And it is not an easy place to be. Both are difficult, getting elected or not getting elected, but certainly because you really put yourself out there and invested and prayed, and all 5 of these folks believe, obviously, that they are being called to be our bishop. And obviously we believe as a search committee that all 5 of these people would do an outstanding job as bishop, but only 1 will be our bishop. And so that vulnerability, which you just spoke of, it's enormous, because you really put yourself out there, and it is life-changing. I will share that with you. It is, yeah.
Well, Phil, thank you so much for your leadership of the search committee, and for all the work that you and the other members of that committee put in to leave us with the slate that we have. And Pat, thank you for your leadership of the transition committee alongside Rick. It's an honor to be a part of that process. And for those listening in, please do go on our diocesan website, click on the search page, read about the candidates, read their answers to the essay questions, stay tuned for the videos that are going to come out. Please tune in to the candidate conversations, learn all that you can about them, whether or not you are a voting delegate, because you, of course, can speak to delegates who represent your congregation. And please be in prayer for all of our nominees, for their families and the communities that they serve, and for our diocese as we move towards May the 1st. It will be a big decision, but an exciting decision for our diocese that has gone so long without a diocesan bishop who will help to lead us, whoever is elected into the future. So we'll leave it right there. Thank you, Phil and Pat, for your time today. Thank you for those who've listened in. I'll be back in a couple of weeks with another edition of Rector's Corner. In the meantime, stay safe, stay well, wear your mask, and you keep the faith. Take care.